So our next speaker, Rich DeMillo, is a very distinguished computer scientist. He's the Warren Chair of Computing at Georgia Tech, a former dean at Georgia Tech, former CTO of Hewlett-Packard, founding chair of the Georgia Tech School of Cybersecurity, and has done vulnerability analysis of Dominion voting machines. He was the author of the National Research Plan for Cybersecurity, which includes election security. Professor DeMillo is a very distinguished contributor, and we're very pleased to have him here. Rich DeMillo.
You want to riff for a couple seconds?
Okay. Rich is a veteran of the Voting Village, by the way. He's been here for several years and has made lots of other contributions to voting system security, has sparred with election officials in Georgia and with others over the properties of Dominion voting systems. And I think, is it showing now?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Rich DeMillo.
Thank you, David. Nice footwork. I want to talk today about research strategy. I know there are researchers in the audience. I know there are administrators in the audience. The topics that Matt was talking about in his introductory remarks are incredibly important. But we've been engaged in Georgia in a 6-year experiment about whether or not any of that stuff actually matters. The progress of the cyber security community in election security has been remarkable, and it was front and center in the state of Georgia, beginning in 2017, with a federal lawsuit that challenged the constitutionality of paperless DRE voting machines. That was decided in favor of the plaintiffs, barring the use of Diebold DREs. And when the state decided to purchase a different kind of voting technology, that lawsuit morphed into a case called Curling v. Raffensperger. And the last time I talked to this group, this audience, we had not been told what the outcome of that case was. It was with the judge. The announcement didn't come until actually after Donald Trump was sworn in 2025. So as I was thinking about what to say about this lawsuit, I had two things on my mind. One is what impact has the research in election security had on the practice of election security? And the other, which I'll get to at the end of this talk, was really a result of watching the hostile takeover of the administrative state by the Trump administration in January of 2025. And these two things in my mind, for reasons that I hope are apparent, kind of came together as I thought about what to say about the Curling v. Raffensperger case. So just as context, let me just say this. The overwhelming focus in election security, the technical aspects of election security, have to do with the research agenda in academic cybersecurity research, which is to identify, analyze, and remediate vulnerabilities in systems. That's not what mattered. What mattered in the Curling v. Raffensperger case was the problem that Matt alluded to at the end of his remarks. What do you say to election administrators who have seen the list of vulnerabilities and yet go forward with conducting an election? So, in March of 2025, the judge released her verdict on the lawsuit, and I'm summarizing here a 150-page judge's order, but for all intents and purposes, what she decided was that although the plaintiffs had done a convincing job in convincing the court that the system was vulnerable, they didn't have standing to bring the lawsuit. I mean, what she said in her opinion was this: legal, moral, ideological, and policy objections do not alone establish a sufficient case or controversy in federal court. She dismissed the case. She dismissed the case not because the system was safe, but she dismissed the case because no one could prove harm. And that's where I want to start. That's where I want to start this talk. Here's what I want to say about research in election integrity. I think of every election as a mission. The mission is to determine the will of the people to such an extent that the loser will acknowledge defeat and the winner can move on to the position that they were elected to. And if you think of this as a mission like you would think of a military mission or a NASA mission, it can succeed or fail. And like most missions that are complicated, the thing that the people that run the mission are trying to do is balance two forces. One is the desire to optimize the administrative part of the project. Program managers, for example, optimize for operations. A successful election is evidence enough that the procedure was sound, and you should go on and accept the results of the elections. Engineers, on the other hand, optimize for reality. And these two things aren't always in sync with each other. And I started looking for ways to make that clear in other fields and other disciplines. And the example I kept coming back to was the 1986 Challenger disaster was a failed mission. And it wasn't clear at the time what the cause was, so President Reagan formed a commission to analyze the Challenger mission. The commission had astronauts on it, it had bureaucrats, it was run by a former Attorney General, and it had Richard Feynman on it, Nobel Prize winning physicist from Caltech. So I want to use this detour to explain what I think is the is the state of the research agenda in election security. The commission wrote its report, made recommendations. Feynman insisted at the end of the public briefing on the report on conducting a demonstration. He took a rubber O-ring seal, immersed it in ice water, and when he took it out of the ice water, slapped it on the desk, and the seal cracked. Why is that important? Why? It's important because the designers of the space shuttle had used rubber seals as a way of sealing tanks that would hold the liquid fuel for the rocket. Now, it's really interesting that this is kind of a low-tech solution to what seems like a high-tech problem. But for some reason, Feynman was aware that plumbers knew about what happens to O-ring seals in cold weather. In fact, the Parker's manual for O-ring seals tells you when not to use a rubber O-ring. NASA knew this. They would test these O-ring seals, and they tested them with every review of the system. In fact, they would say in the briefings that they gave to NASA management that it would be a potential loss of vehicle event if one of these O-ring seals should fail. So naturally, they tested them every chance they got. And you can see, and this is an early SRB, solid rocket booster critical items list, where they talk about the O-ring seals, and they talk about O-ring failure as a loss of vehicle event, and they say that, well, we've tested them under every condition we can think of, and they haven't failed, which they took as evidence that the O-ring seals were safe. Of course, what they never did was to test them in the conditions under which the Challenger was actually launched, which was below freezing temperatures in Florida, a rare event. And that's exactly what failed. So this idea of a potential loss of vehicle event in a mission, a critical mission like this, became part of the vocabulary of engineering in the middle 80s, largely driven by this investigation. The Rogers Commission made its recommendations. NASA promised to change the way that they did business, and it wasn't until I don't know, 8 years later that there was another potential loss of vehicle event that was caused by exactly the same behavior. The Columbia shuttle exploded because a chunk of foam was sloughed off the launch nose cone of the launch vehicle, struck the forward wing of the space shuttle, caused a tile to come loose, and on re-entry, the Columbia burned up. Now they had done exactly the same kind of analysis on Columbia that they did for Challenger. But you can see, I mean, this is an example of an email from mission management, which says that yes, we know you do damage to wings when it's struck by foam, but we're going to consider that to be a dead issue. It was all summarized in the report that was written, the postmortem report that was written for the Columbia accident. And the critical thing about that report was that it identified what had been going on in NASA for 20 years, which is that NASA administrators were getting reports that said anomalies happened during tests, and they decided to go on with the mission nevertheless. In fact, there's a section of the report, in chapter 8, called the normalization of deviance. What is the normalization of deviance? Normalization of deviance is the gradual acceptance of anomalies as normal, not because managers are reckless, but because institutional pressures, budgets, schedules, political considerations get prioritized. And you know, if you look at the history of these accidents, this normalization leads to catastrophic outcomes if they're not scrutinized. Now, I'm telling you this story because the Curling case was a study in normalization of deviance. When closing arguments were made in January of 24, the plaintiff's case ran to 200 PowerPoint slides with what seemed like a never-ending sequence of vulnerabilities, all of which were validated by not only the plaintiff's experts, but also the defendant's experts, validated by CISA. The defendants, the state defendants, had less than 100 slides in their deck and made no attempt to refute any of the vulnerabilities. What they said was it didn't matter because administrative considerations took priority over technical considerations, which was not something that a court could decide. So what I want to say is that elections have foam strikes too. The foam strikes were the vulnerabilities that were argued as a case for outlawing the Dominion ballot marking devices, but they weren't treated as potential loss of vehicle events. Now, it's not because we hadn't thought of things that way. During the course of the trial, the Secretary of State's office commissioned a report from MITRE Corporation, which listed all the vulnerabilities and explained why those were loss of vehicle events. And then said what? It said it didn't matter. Because the election was deemed to be successful, none of those potential loss of vehicle events mattered in the argument. We're talking about a difference of opinion between two sets of bureaucrats in a state agency. That's not something that a court can decide. There were 49 of these things in the MITRE report. It wasn't the first time that the state election officials had heard this story. There was an EVN study of what turned out to be potential loss of vehicle events, authored in 2016. A long list, 30 or so separate vulnerabilities. In a book that's coming out in 2027, we'll have an analysis of all of those events. The upshot is that There is nothing that the court can do to prevent a hostile Secretary of State's office, an indifferent legislature, from just normalizing the vulnerabilities that it sees. Even though the principles, the engineering principles, are textbook engineering principles. If you want to eliminate buffer overflows in a system, you use memory-safe languages. If you want to eliminate single points of failure, use redundancy. If you want to eliminate software dependence, eliminate software from the critical trust path. And to eliminate the foam strike risk for elections, don't place fragile system components in the path of known potential loss of vehicle events. And we don't do that. So those of us who do research in cybersecurity don't think about systems in that way. It requires us to step back from the way that the systems are built and consider not the individual technical things, which frankly speaking are the things that draw people to cybersecurity research. It's kind of fun to break things because it causes you to step back and think about what does risk mean in these systems, and we don't have an underlying theory of risk. I mean, even when Philip will talk to you about risk in his discussion of RLAs, we still don't have a comprehensive way of thinking about what happens if people decide to misuse the RLA algorithms. If they decide to normalize, for example, changing the sampling procedure in real time and accepting that as a positive audit result. So what I'm really advocating here is that we think about election integrity research not in terms of the individual vulnerabilities, the individual technical steps that we make, but this idea of refusing to accept the normalization of deviation. It should no longer be the case that an election office can say there is no one in charge of cybersecurity. That is a potential loss of vehicle event. It should no longer be the case that election rules should well, I mean, we'll take an example that you'll hear about later in this conference, that election rules should normalize the loss of ballot secrecy because we don't think that's important. And every time we go through one of these cycles where nothing bad happens if we just stretch the rules a bit, we're in a situation of bringing under the umbrella of normalization of deviance something that will eventually lead to failure. Let me just end by saying this. In a real sense, election security is a canary in the coal mine for administrative software in general. So when you see things like this happen in related disciplines, in related fields, you immediately turn your attention to the next set of threats. And everything that we see going on in election security can be repeated in other aspects of civic software. My advice to the research community, my advice to program managers is to assume some agency here. I think our role has been marginalized. I think the role of researchers has been marginalized. We're passive observers. We're witnesses in litigation that we actually have no chance of winning to begin with. My hope is that we can kind of move things in the same way that you see in the case of failures like you saw in NASA in the area of election security. Thank you.